Welcome to Kaleidoscope, a conversation about arts, creativity, and the intersection of ideas. We're bringing together faculty from the Institute of Creative and Collaborative Arts at Eastern Kentucky University. Our series of podcasts begins today, and we're excited to talk about representation. So what does representation mean in the fields of music, art, and communication? I'm Ginny Whitehouse, your host for Kaleidoscope, and I'll ask each of our guests to introduce themselves and their field of expertise.
I'm Jill Campbell. I'm an associate professor of vocal music education.
I'm John King, associate professor of public relations.
Hi, I'm Charlie Campbell, assistant professor of graphic design at the School of Art and Design.
Excellent. And Charlie, you're not related to Jill, are you?
No, we get to know each other a little better. Maybe we can claim adopted.
Their cousins are good. Right. Cousins are good. So thank you all for joining the conversation. Again, we're talking about the meaning of representation. Jill, what is important to you about representation in music?
I really feel that everyone who is working in music, whether they're participating, whether they're directing it, whether they're writing it, they deserve to see themselves reflected in their experience in music. And very often, I feel like that has not been the case. For a very long time, Western music was really only represented by white, wealthy, mostly men. And that became a real issue because so many people were just left out making music, engaging in music, whether that's in your community, in your school. And it was just really difficult. This past summer, I traveled to Austria and I got to teach in the Keys program here through EKU. And that was a fantastic experience. And one of the most amazing things that we did there is we went and we saw the original archives of Mozart's manuscripts.
Wow.
And we walked right across the street and we were able to see the church in which those compositions were played. But one of the things that I really noticed was that some of those original manuscripts were by Mozart's sister, who by all accounts was as good of a musician as he was, but is never really spoken about because women were not expected to even be inclined to play music or to do something like that with their mind and to use those skills. And so as we've come along our journey in representation and with the rights of all humans, what I'm thinking about when I'm programming for a semester is, am I making sure that the music that I bring into the classroom, that the poetry in choral music that's so important, and guest artist leadership, am I making sure that everyone has the opportunity to see themselves reflected in that? If I'm doing that, they have more of a chance to go out and use their music in new ways and creative ways and to make our world just better and more colorful. And so that to me is just something I think about all the time with music and representation.
That impacts everything you do, both in your performances, in what music you select.
Absolutely.
All those things.
Absolutely.
John, I know you have some very similar concerns about representation of women in media images.
Yeah, I'm interested in how people of gender and all races and backgrounds, ethnicities, nationalities are represented in the media, because there's a theory, cultivation theory, which says that the media present false images in the way that people are represented, and that can cause people to have a different perception about reality than actually exists. Another theory that I've done a lot of research on is called facism theory. And it gets to when you have mediated images of people. Now, I look at candidates primarily.
Presidential candidates?
Presidential candidates. I've done several studies in this area and other areas. Generally, the theory says that images of men tend to be cropped more like head and shoulders, and so there's more facial prominence. And images of women tend to crop to show more of the figure of the body. And so there's actually been social science research on this, that viewers of images of men cropped in tight, it's a tight facial shot, people assign more power and intellect to those individuals, as opposed to women. They're generally cropped that show the figure, the opposite side of that equation, right? So the literature review on this is really interesting. It goes back to postage stamps, artwork from the 1400s. There have been experiments where people are asked to draw pictures of men and women, and generally they have the same effect. It seems to be very culturally bound and almost culturally universal, actually. I've done studies, and I did a study just recently in the New Hampshire presidential primary comparing images of Trump and Nikki Haley. And I found that pictures of Trump were much more focused on the face, and pictures of Haley were much more focused on the body. And I actually developed a scale, which is based on a broadcasting shot kind of selection, close-ups, medium shots, a 6-point scale on where the image is cropped on the body, and found statistical significance difference here. I did a study once across 17 different nations in Latin America about women and men in sports, and found the exact same result, that images of men tended to show more facial prominence than images of women. And so it seems to be universal. I just collected the data for the presidential election comparing Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. There's several dimensions here, because there's the gender dimension, but also racial dimension and national origin. And so, according to the theory, the white male candidate of American descent is going to show more facial prominence than the African American female of Indian descent.
You mean the European descent?
Yeah.
European descent.
Yeah, that's a hypothesis, right?
And so you're still working on gathering. Did you tell me you had like 5,000 images? 5,000
images. What I did is I took the key image from YouTube presentations from all of the national networks in the U.S., television networks, and do an analysis of those still images to arrive at this. And I haven't analyzed it yet, but that's what the hypothesis is, that the male images will be much more facially prominent.
Really interesting, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlie, you have some big questions to ask along the same line about accuracy in image representation.
Yeah, thank you for phrasing it that way too. I want to pose these as questions, observations, and questions about sort of the state of technology and in the software that we use to produce visual communication, or communication in any sense. Right. I mean, so communication, to say that we are in our respective fields always in flux, especially right now, it's an understatement of the year. Well, the software and the people that produce that and how they produce that, by extension, is going to also be in flux. So, as I am a professor of visual communication, essentially, I'm tasked with training my students, not only like many of you, to, utilize for us, the basic elements and principles of design and communication, follow these guidelines. I'm also expected to teach software and provide them with that technical aspect. And I'll get to the point of representation here in a second, because it feels a little overwhelming now. And I have conversations of the options. The overwhelming part is the amount of options that are available. We have industry standards for a very long time. And again, this applies to most people in this room. I would say Adobe is creating the software that we tend to use to create our professional designs. While access is increasing enormously for technology globally, almost anyone in any country can get their hands on some sort of, wonderful device that they're able to express themselves with, any individual person, and create now in ways that they were never able to, 5 years ago, and that soon ago, with software that now exists that outputs pretty legitimate, technically legitimate files that are directly competing with our industry standards. And that's causing some friction between the professionals and what is perceived as, the amateurs. And this is where we get into issues of representation for me. And representation and access are related I see and have felt in my own life. I'm from Eastern Kentucky originally, very, kind of disadvantaged socioeconomically. Had beautiful, family and life. I'm not complaining about that experience. I'm grateful for it. But, we couldn't afford a computer. We couldn't afford these things. And I sure could not afford Adobe Photoshop. It just wasn't happening. So I learned to train myself on something called JASC Paint Shop Pro.
I had that too.
Yeah. And at the time, it was a pretty good, analog. And there are very valid very valid critiques to that, using software like that against something like Photoshop, right? Because it outputs professional stuff in a professional way that we need those technical, aspects to come out of that software to suit the need. I'm blabbering a little bit.
That's okay. Charlie, let me pull you to the point that it almost sounds like, and I made a note, that the kinds of conversations you were talking about, access and representation between pros and amateurs, is very similar to arts versus crafts.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. If I could share a personal experience.
Please.
I went to Rochester Institute of Technology for graduate school, which is also home to the American School of Craft. And I was an art student first and foremost, and I thought of myself as an art with a capital A, right? And I'm there in that capacity. They paired us in our graduate studies and some of our seminars with those students from the craft school. And I could not be more grateful that happened, because even though I'm from Appalachia, I was surrounded by crafts, I never really got that perspective of having those folks in the room with me talking about the same stuff. And it changed everything. It changed the way that I thought about, art, period.
Jill, that has some parallels to your points that you were making.
Absolutely. Charlie, one of the things that you just said was you said that these tools allow people to express themselves.
Yeah.
And I feel the exact same way about music, that working here in the Institute of Collaborative and Creative Arts, that is our goal, is to provide tools for human beings to be able to be clearer in their own self and their own soul, and to share that with others. I feel that I was made to be a communicator and to help others express themselves through music. And so one of the things that's been really tricky for me working in this field is that there are not many women that are on the podium at the collegiate level or at the professional level. A few years back, there was a peer-reviewed study that was done that looked at the fact that there were about 13% of the conductors in the collegiate field right now that were women. And in the past few years, that's inched up more towards 20%. But if you happen to also have an intersection of being LGBTQIA+, if you happen to be a non-white or non-white presenting person, if you happen to have any of these categories that intersect with your biological sex, those numbers drop even more significantly. And so that's something that I have worked really hard to think about. Not very long ago, we brought in several college choirs from across the state. We worked with them and we did a combined concert. Initially, there had been 5 choirs that were going to participate. We ended up doing this event with 3 choirs. These were all treble choirs, which tend to be students who identify as female in those singing ranges. I was the only director of any of those choirs who was a female, and I conducted that concert. That felt really important to me, for those young singers to see themselves on that podium. I want them to know that it is possible to be the next person to do those things, because that might be what they were created to do as well.
That's beautiful.
Thank you for that, Jill, because I'm thinking that lack of representation or that otherness of representation can really be a big problem. John, you talked a lot about the difference between how women and men are portrayed in positions of power.
Yeah.
When women are seen as less powerful, what's the impact?
The impact is that as we saw, they lose elections for one thing, unfortunately sometimes. But also, there's another scholar who talks about symbolic annihilation of women. That if you look at media coverage in general, it's mostly about 2/3 of the coverage is about men, and that women are a much smaller proportion. And I can't remember the researcher's name, but the term was symbolic annihilation, that they don't exist and aren't seen. In the profession I teach, public relations, it's predominantly women. About 80% of people in this profession are women, but most of the managers are still men, mostly white men. So representation also in public relations means that we are almost always working with diverse audiences, and we have to ensure that the messages that we put out visually and otherwise represent people from many diverse backgrounds.
I have a question for you about that, if you don't mind, John. So when you're talking about that symbolic annihilation, my question is, do you think that continues to the gender pay gap that we're always talking about, because there is a lack of perceived power and importance potentially?
Absolutely. I mean, news coverage tends to cover the most powerful, influential people in societies, and if women are not proportionally represented there, that certainly contributes to that.
I feel like along those same lines, that contributes to women not being allowed to make decisions about their own health care, about their own needs. For example, if women are not allowed to say what is right for them and for their body, when someone goes to, say, report a domestic violence claim, they're not going to be seen as being able to make that decision for themselves because they're not represented with the same influence and power, is what I'm hearing you say. And that rings true, but I'm curious. I was curious to see what you thought.
One other area, the study I did, in fact, the very first article I published was in an African journal. And it was about New York Times coverage, whether people were named or not, based on their gender and their nationality and their race. And you could probably guess what the outcome of that was. Males are more likely to be named than women. People of color less likely to be named than whites. And Americans more likely to be named than people from other nationalities. And this is New York Times, which is the gold standard of reporting. It's a inherent, I don't want to say bias, but it is an inherent situation that has to do with how we value people that are outside of the power structure. That's what it boils down to, I think.
Charlie, with that in mind, it's not just a matter of what somebody chooses to take a picture of or what image appears. It's also a matter of the creator. What happens when we have a limited number of creators?
Oh my goodness, we have a very limited perspective on what is offered to the world as a picture of reality. Because what we do as visual communicators of any stripe, really, honestly, is we take, the information, we take a message, we're trying to solve a problem in some way, we're building a piece of communication to be clear to speak or show or demonstrate. And if the only people at the table with that power are, within one slice of society, the message that's going to come out is going to be a biased message no matter what. If they're trying really hard, even to have that diverse, perspective or that respect for other cultures, they couldn't possibly perform in a way, that someone with that, life history and those experiences that they didn't have is capable of.
Can you think of an illustration or an example of that?
Absolutely, yes. I'm glad you asked that. I was waiting to say, we know, all of us, the kind of driving force in technology was Silicon Valley, right? So it's Silicon Valley boom and this venture capital sort of model of approaching technology. Well, that has a stranglehold in a sense. I'm maybe being a little hyperbolic on the processes that we have agreed on to utilize the visual communication technology that we offer the world. So that was the architects of how we do this on a global scale, the architects of the software that we use that is, apparently that is actually living as a standard for how we produce things, Adobe and other examples. And I'm not vilifying that, them for existing being standard. My point is that was built by a group of artists and technologists that came from a very specific place on the globe in Silicon Valley, and by and large, which is a very diverse place, right?
Depends on how you define diversity.
Yeah, but it's only coming from within American culture. It's only coming from within that kind of American perspective on business. It's built by them, constructed by them. Again, no, not with ill intent in any way, but just with bias and perspective that couldn't be helped.
So the key I'm hearing is it's not just about representation, it's about access.
Absolutely. I think they're inexorably tied in my mind.
So, and I'm addressing this to everyone to jump in. What is the impact on creativity? How does access impact on creativity? And from that, how can we increase access to positively impact creativity?
Can I add a little bit about this technology just to answer that question directly off of this
Thanks,
momentum?
Charlie. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, we can foster communities that are building communities of technologists and designers and coders that are building software, from different perspectives for different people. One of the things that I'm saying wonderful and I kind of uptick in are apps built specifically for people with ADHD or people that are on differing neurological, the different part of the neurological perspective. To-do apps that are made specifically for, I have a bit of ADHD. I'm willing to share that, diagnosed, and I see someone for help with that. There are apps that are built to do productivity apps, built specifically to tailor to that. And, I want to make sure when I'm talking about here, representation, I have a lot of privilege, right? So I'm not talking about my access. I'm talking about access for people who might be disadvantaged. So giving access and keys to that software, accessing keys to those apps tailored specifically for however, they view and see the world, and however we can empower them to be visual communicators is a wonderful thing. That's giving that access allows that representation to happen.
John, you look like you want to jump in
When I
here.
think about access, I think about algorithms online, and how that relates to representation. I mean, people are kind of self-selecting the channels that they pay attention to be related to access, and those media channels can be very distorted. And if you're only exposing yourself to one particular genre of news content or entertainment content, it can really have an impact on your perception of the world, perception of people.
When we were talking about that, I was thinking about the dispute over the title world music, because even saying world music is like not American. So, and it's lumping the entire rest of the planet into one group. And so it's us and other. Jill, what are your thoughts about that?
That is definitely something that the literature and the experts in the field are really talking about right now in music. The two terms that have typically been used have been Western music, which is mostly European music, and sort of the way that has spread, versus non-Western music. And if you talk about Western, you probably think, what is Eastern music in a direct parallel? And Eastern music would be very different. This would be Asian music, Indian music, music that does not operate with a strict chord structure. It operates more in themes and ragas and these very different ways of playing and listening to music and appreciating music. But you had asked, does access impact creativity? And I would say yes, because you might not even know where your talents lie or what you're gifted in if you've never had the chance to experience something. And I feel like if we can allow, the very first thing is to see parts of each student like that I work with, if I can see them being reflected in what we're programming and how we're doing that, then they might have a spark. They might have a spark in their soul that just says, maybe I can write that poem. Maybe I can set that to music. Maybe I can try a new instrument. Maybe something is going to light the world up for me that I don't even know yet. And that's what it makes me think of.
That warms my heart a little bit. I'm a dad, and I'm going to be dad for a second and share a little bit about my kid. I'll brag about the kid, right? I have an experience. I've had these experiences with him trying to share creativity, the access to creativity. So, again, I'm incredibly privileged. My son is incredibly privileged. I want to acknowledge that. I have access to things that other people don't. But, I'm reflecting, on my access to music as a child. I wanted music very badly. I live with music every day. I live and breathe. I can't work without listening to something. I just can't function. So I respect your field, holy cow, and admire it. And I want my son to be able to express himself in that way if he so chooses. So I have been scrapping and buying stuff off of Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist since the day he was born. And I have amassed this collection of musical instruments, and I have no idea how to play at all. And I will just pick and go. I'm really good at tech, and I can solder and take electronics apart. So I've repaired things, and it's not about me. I'm excited about that. I'm engaged about that. But I'm watching him now have that in his life. As a 7-year-old, it's starting to pay dividends that he can reach out and grab something. And then one more small example. So as a design professional, as a digital artist, as a traditional artist as well, I try to do both and serve in both capacities. I want him to also have that, visual creativity access. And I have an iPad. It's a relatively older model, iPad Pro. It's got a pencil. It's not the greatest piece of tech. It's not the newest piece of tech.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. It works. There exists, and I don't want to sell an app right now. This is not.
That's okay. Go ahead.
But there exists an app called Nomad. Nomad is a 3-dimensional sculpting app. So one could think Maya. I think we teach Maya here on campus in one program or another. Maya is legitimate 3D design software used in special effects, etc. It's awesome stuff. Nomad is not rich like Maya. Nomad does not do all the things that it does, but what Nomad does do is it gives you on an iPad a lump of clay. You see it. You can move the iPad around. You can poke that clay, make a hole in it, spin it with your fingers, poke it and pull. So you can push and pull clay just as if it's in front of you. Not with your hands yet, but if you've seen or played with Apple's AR, VR device, wow, you can. And I watch him without training soar. Just soar because of that access to do things I could never have imagined doing.
So that literally opens new neural pathways through that process. So the access is not only inspiring creativity, but it's reshaping the brain.
I just want to mention, you mentioned world music, Jill, reminded me. I lived in United Arab Emirates for 9 years. I taught just outside of Dubai. I saw a electric oud, 2,000-year-old instrument, electrified, and heard a lot of Arabic music. Never hear any Arabic music since I've come back to the States.
Can I jump in and give you one little piece? I'm very excited about the notion of an electric dulcimer. My papa made dulcimers, and I'm tinkering right now, y'all. I'm going to make me some electric dulcimers. I need somebody to play them.
Do we have any concluding thoughts?
I just feel very thankful that here at our school, we are invested in the creative process for our students and for our faculty. I think that as we continue to grow as a school and adapt to this ever-changing world with technology, that still some of these basic creative needs, we're finding new ways to meet them. And I love it. And I'm really proud that we're doing that.
Here. I want to agree with you. And I just want to reiterate that I am so excited about the access that I see happening. And, we see developments in other countries that don't have the same kind of economic geography that we do, where they are accessing, those folks in that country are able to access provide professional services on a global scale, on a global market, and compete.
Well, this has really been a true kaleidoscope here, I think, with my colleagues from art and design and music, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of that. Just one final thought I wanted to say is that one of the problems with misrepresentation, especially in media and music and art world, is that if people don't have direct experience with cultures, people different from themselves, if they're only getting it from media, and I'm going to use that in a broad term, it's not accurate, and it's the root of a lot of racism and other problems that exist because of this. And I think that at EKU, we're working very hard to change that perspective.
Thank you all for this great conversation today on representation. Jill Campbell, Charlie Campbell, John King, you are amazing representatives of your fields. Thanks to Emily Hofelich for producing this podcast. I'm Ginny Whitehouse, host of Kaleidoscope. You're listening to the Eastern Progress Media Network.